Hello, folks. Welcome back to Chris Wyatt Reports. This is Chris live in Central Pennsylvania. Special guest today, someone I've hoped to get on the program for a long time since I started doing this independent journalism thing a couple years ago. Dr. Anthea Jeffery from South Africa. She has done a lot of research on the politics and the history of South Africa, including something we're going to talk about today, the National Democratic Revolution. For those of you not familiar with it, I think you're in for a treat. Dr. Jeffery, it's a distinct pleasure to have you on the program. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, and I have to say hello to all your listeners.
Well, we have a pretty diverse, real diversity, not one of these, one of those, a black, a brown, a blue, a Christian, Jew, a Muslim, not that kind of diversity, but genuine diversity of thought. Although lately, a lot of the people showing up on the program are thinking about refugee, but but that's a whole different topic. So we have an audience from around the world. About half are based in South Africa at this time, and the rest are in America, the UK, some in Canada, and we still have folks that watch us in China, and a couple in Thailand, and then also Australia and New Zealand. It's of course where the South African diaspora has been for the past 30 years. That's part of it. A lot of former South Africans, but also a lot of people with interest in South Africa. So I think they'll find our conversation interesting. So, Dr. Jeffery, could you? I mean, it's never fun to do self-promotion. It's not what it is because I'm asking you as the host. Could you tell people a little bit about your background, so because not everybody knows your name. You're not a household name for everybody. They should be a household name, but you're not. So tell us a little bit about yourself and your educational background and your research, if you don't mind.
Sure. No, I was born and grew up in South Africa, and I studied law for many years. I began with an LLB at Wits University in Johannesburg, and then I got the chance to go and study at Cambridge University. I had a great interest in public international law, and that's what I focused on there. And then later I got the chance to do a PhD in law at London University, and that was again on a human rights issue. I had thought that I would become a lawyer in London, but really I think I hankered to be back in South Africa and trying to do something about the apartheid situation and what our future might hold for us. And so I came back here, and initially I worked for the Urban Foundation, which had been created after the Soweto Revolt in 1976. And the aim there was to try and improve housing, education, and in time local government. So it began more political dimension to it. But I think I really found my great interest when I joined the South African Institute of Race Relations way back in 1990, because the IRR had been created in 1929 as the first ever anti-apartheid organization before the word apartheid had even been coined. But as an organization which was concerned about racial discrimination, trying to build racial goodwill, obviously had a very important part to play in the apartheid period. What I think also distinguished the IRR was the leadership of John Cain Berman, who was one of the very few people to chart an independent course. As it became clearer that apartheid was on the way out, that the ANC was probably on the way in, John was one of the few people who felt that the ANC also needed to be put under critical scrutiny, that one couldn't just accept its bona fides. And so when I joined the IRR at a time when the ANC had just been unbanned, Mandela had just been released, there was a great sense of, we had change of an unprecedented kind. We also had political violence of an extraordinary intensity, because we'd had the ANC waging what I discovered was a people's war for about 5 years then. But once the stakes were higher, once the first non-racial election was pending, it became absolutely vital for the ANC to consolidate its power on the ground, to weaken its black rivals, particularly the Inkatha Freedom Party and the Black Consciousness organizations. And so there was actually a great upsurge in violence. It didn't affect the whites very much, but it certainly affected Black people in the townships, particularly if they were in areas where the IFP had a presence, or worse still for them, if they were suspected to have some links to the IFP, or if they didn't sufficiently participate in the ANC's mass action, the various boycott campaigns that it implemented to further weaken the economy and put pressure on the negotiations so that they would in the end yield an outcome which the ANC was pleased to enjoy. And all the strategy did in fact work remarkably well, to the point that Joe Slovo, who was of course a very prominent figure in the SACP, described the constitutional negotiations and the interim constitution which they generated as a famous victory for the ANC and its allies in the SACP. And he said that because he was quite clear, and rightly so, that the new constitution and finally the final constitution, which would replace the interim one, would make it very much easier for the ANC to implement a national democratic revolution once it had won power. So I began working for the IRR as, I think, a very naive individual with very little knowledge of what the ANC had done over the years or what its real plans were. But I learned enormously through my role at the organization and ended up writing a book on People's War and then looking at various aspects of the transition, beginning with the propaganda which had accompanied the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, not a view which many people understand or share, but then moving on in time to the way in which the National Democratic Revolution was being implemented. And that has been a keen focus of mine, really, particularly for the last 15, 20 years.
Well, that's a great summary to get us started there. I just was making a note there because you've touched on a few points I'd love to get on there. But it's interesting, though, the Institute for Race Relations, as you allude to, has been around for nearly a century. And it's been a bulwark even before the concept of apartheid was created in the late 1940s. Of course, just less than 2 decades after the Union of South Africa Act, when the country was really, as a country, relatively new, yet dealing with this issue pretty early on. So they started pretty early, and it's still going, and still is committed to a non-racialism, and that's kind of really where the Institute for Race Relations is at. That's where I found it interesting. It's odd because if you look at it from a distance, you look, okay, this is an anti-apartheid organization if you don't get to understand it. And now it's like, wait a second, is it anti, what's going on now? But it seems to be consistently an organization that's focused on non-racialism and fairness and equality for all South Africans. Would that be a fair description?
Absolutely, yes. And we always declined to categorize people by race in the apartheid era, and we still declined to do that. And to our mind, the word non-racialism had a very clear meaning in terms of which people were not to be treated differently on the basis of their race. It would be very important to have a form of redress that increased opportunities for those who had been discriminated against in the past. But you didn't need to use race in order to do that. You could look directly to who was disadvantaged. And unfortunately, when you use race as a proxy for disadvantage, what happens over time is that the people who are now the least disadvantaged are the most able to take advantage of those rules. So we've seen increasingly over time that what BEE has done is to widen inequality within the country, and particularly, of course, within the Black population, which is by far the majority population. So you have a small group that has done extremely well out of BEE, become millionaires, billionaires, some of it, unfortunately, by corrupt means. And then the great majority of poor people who happen to be Black, who simply have no chance of benefiting from BEE because either they don't have the skills that are required to move into management posts and employment, or they don't have the sort of contacts that are necessary to secure tenders from the state. So it's the ANC's cadres who benefit, the ANC's patronage machine that is fed. And we go through a sort of pretense that BEE is helping the poor, and it's absolutely not. It's what might be called a bait and switch policy, where you use the plight of the poor to secure policies that help the relative elite. And we've been arguing now for a long time that we should shift to economic empowerment for the disadvantaged, which would offer the poorest people a real chance of getting ahead.
Well, that's an argument I've made for a long time, is that the system is set up really for an elite coterie of oligarchs and a cater class that enriches themselves at the expense of everyone else. You know, there's, of course, with the population surge, you go back to 92, there's about 34 million people in South Africa. Today, 63 million roughly, depending on who's counting the numbers. And the number of Black South Africans living in abject poverty is more than triple what it was in 1994 from the sheer numbers of growth. We can blame that on all kinds of things, and the ANC likes to blame it on apartheid and Jan van Riebeck and all sorts of things in systemic racism. And while there are lingering legacies of that, spatial displacement, things like that, that's definitely true. The reality from my point of view is that the failed macroeconomic policies of the ANC are part of the problem here. If we go back to 1994, I was a young captain in 94, and then I went back and taught at Iowa State University, where I did a graduate program, and my thesis was focused on the housing subsidy program, which I thought was all wrong. It was based on income, and I'm like, that's stupid. It should be based on need. And so, unfortunately, he's using something I never want to see again, regression analysis in graduate school. Using regression analysis, I came up with a formula that would base it, if you had a mother who was living alone in KZN because her husband's working the mines up in the Highveld, and she's got 3 kids. Well, she needs space. There's so much. You've got the sex, between the boys and girls, the rooms, abolition units, all that. Anyway, long story short, I came up with a better solution than the ANC did for their RDP housing. It just never got published, and so they wouldn't have known about it. They probably wouldn't listen. But in '94, as a young captain, I said to people, because they're asking about South Africa, because they knew I followed Africa, and I said, well, in my view, there's 3 things South Africa needs to do. Number 1, they need to fix the policing. The police under apartheid were very good at keeping the white minority not exposed to violent crime for the most part. A lot of white South Africans were completely oblivious to what was going on around them in some respects. And so they were not victims of crime like black South Africans, coloreds, and Indians were. And I said, you need to fix policing. So you need to take the police and take them from instrument of oppression and law enforcement to a community policing model so that people trust the police. They're on the streets. They're out there every day. You have to train them. You have to equip them. You have to improve forensics. And then you also have to work in the criminal justice system to prosecute so you have a system of deterrence. I said, you got to fix that first. Without security, nothing follows. You have to have security. I know people on the left love to say, oh, kumbaya, we don't need police, but you need police. So I said, fix policing. Number 2, you've got to fix education. You've got to fix it. Now, there were some folks who were black under apartheid who managed, Dr. Wade Mkhize, managed to go to school, primary school, secondary school, high school, university, became a medical doctor practicing during the apartheid era in South Africa. But that's an exception. That was the rarity. So you need to fix the system so that everyone gets lifted up. Instead, they've destroyed education, lowered the standards, and pilfered so much money. And the third thing I talked about was that when it was clear, and this idea came to me then, but I wasn't sure how to do it until I saw what the government was doing. The government was, in my view, shaking down the business community so that they could keep the status quo going by giving equity stakes over. And they wound up going to people who were connected, and they became rich, like the president, among others. So that equity stake, instead of shaking it down and giving it to these connected ANC elites, should have gone into a national sovereign wealth fund. And then my view was that sovereign wealth fund, if it generated income above and beyond the cost of operating it, then it could be a payout. So you could create an ownership society in South Africa, and it would be based on income level. So a South African family, whether black, white, or brown, who made less than 10,000 Rand, if there's a payout, they would get it. If you made more than 10,000, you miss out because we didn't make enough money, but you're contributing to it. So those 3 ideas, all of which fell on the rocky shores of great ideas, nothing ever came to fruition. Had any of those been employed, I think we'd be better off. Anyway, that was a long point there. But do you think any of those ideas might have helped, or am I just an idealist?
No, I think they would have. I think the housing program has really faltered. Ironically, we've supposedly now built about 4 million houses or so, and yet the waiting list for housing is even longer than it was before. And the number of informal settlements has greatly expanded, partly, of course, because the population is growing, and we're getting people in from the rest of the continent and a lot of internal migration. But it's also because the policy is just the wrong policy. And it very much depends on the government deciding who should build the houses. And again, BEE procurement has been such a problem there, because very often the contracts go to people with very little interest in performing the contracts. A black journalist said back in 2007, the first thing that the black contractor does, unfortunately, is to pocket a lot of the money and buy the biggest 4x4 by far. And then, what is left can be used for housing, and the quality of it is often very bad, and so on. It would have been much better if we had set up a system where there was real innovation and competition, and an incentive to do well by people instead of, as it were, rip them off. And you're quite right that education has truly deteriorated. And I think the idea of having a sovereign wealth fund that provides some income for people who are really poor, and they can then use it to meet their needs, is a much better way than the government's plan of putting everybody dependent very much on what they provide to them, which has nothing to do with how a market is operating, but only with how much tax they can squeeze out of the economy. So they're crippling the productive side of the economy and pretending that having half the population almost on social grants is a good solution to poverty.
Well, it's quite sad. Watching the State of the Nation address, Cyril Ramaphosa almost crowing and boasting, we have 28 million people getting grants. I'm like, dude, you should be embarrassed. I mean, the fact that we have 6 or 8 million people getting food stamps in America, I find incredibly embarrassing. We want everyone to be uplifted. You'll always have people, for whatever circumstances, who live in poverty. You cannot overcome poverty, eradicate it entirely. That's a dream world. But certainly, level of poverty is unnecessary in South Africa. It's really sad, and it starts with the education. And look, a lot of things happening in South Africa are not unique to South Africa. We have the same sort of problems here and in the Western world. For instance, this I've watched dishearteningly as I've grown up in my life, this culture of entitlement and expectation that people are owed things. And we see it, and it starts to manifest in a clear fashion in South Africa for the public to observe. If they're not paying close attention, it becomes obvious with the fees must fall movement and that nonsense, people thinking they're entitled to university. And there was a big discussion on this when my channel first started, people talking about this. It's 5 years ago when I started doing this. And I said, look, people have to realize that no one's entitled to tertiary education. I mean, if you look at the planet as a whole, 8 billion people, less than 1% of human beings will ever spend 1 minute in a university or a technicon classroom. Less than 1%. So the mere fact that you attend a school, whether you came there as a rich child of Anton Rupert or Tokyo Sexwale, or you're one of the Trumps, or you go there someone that went on public aid because they're dirt poor like I did my first time at university, you are elite just by your appearance at university. Even if you fail out, you had an opportunity that most human beings don't get. And the behavior of people with fees must fall, thinking they're entitled to get free things at other people's expense, I found to be quite insulting. And we see it here in the States now with Biden and the nonsense of this moral bankruptcy of forgiving student loans. You made the loan consciously to go to university, to enter into university. And university graduates tend to make 7 to 15 times lifetime earnings of non-university graduates. And you want the plumber, the baker, the candlestick maker, and the guy that sweeps the streets to pay taxes so you get a free ride to forgive your loan? I'm sorry, I'm very emotional about this one. I think it's morally bankrupt, and it's the same situation I have. This culture of entitlement is shocking to me, and it's facilitated by the political parties in South Africa who keep giving the impression that that the people are entitled to things. And now we'll get to this hopefully a little bit later on, but the expropriation without compensation, we see what's happening in Seshego, up in Polokwane, Petersburg, and also down near East London, where people just occupying land a la Zimbabwe 25 years ago and parceling out little pieces and saying, okay, now we want services. It's very frightening what's coming, this culture of expectation, entitlement. Any thoughts on that?
No, I think you're absolutely right. It is a big problem. It's something that also has a political dimension that the ANC tried to foster. For example, during the People's War period, when the ANC was really jockeying for power and trying to erode all its rivals, which included the National Party government, of course, which at that point, surprisingly, was actually trying to roll out electricity and water and better services to the townships, and had a great housing sale so that people who'd been living in municipal housing could buy their houses for minuscule amounts of money. The ANC instituted a rent boycott, and it enforced it with necklacings and violence. And the trouble is that rent boycott continues to this day, so that the amount of money which ordinary households now owe the municipalities has reached something like 385 billion rand. And that's why also the municipalities can't pay Eskom, they can't pay the water boards, those services are crumbling. And people were given an expectation that they didn't need to pay for things that they needed, and that they had this entitlement to free services and so on from the state. In the university context, I thought it was a great shame that there was so much violence accompanying the fees must fall protests, with damage to the universities in the end totaling about 800 million rand, huge amount of money. And then there was a commission of inquiry run by Judge Arthur Heer, which came to a sensible recommendation, I thought, on university funding, that students should get income contingent loans, which they would repay once their earnings reached a certain proportion. He said the South Africa simply can't afford to provide free education for everyone, quite right. His emphasis was more on the need for more technical and vocational education, where there would probably be a greater number of jobs available. But for the universities, he thought it vital to have these income contingent loans, which would be repaid, so that the fiscus would not be in this situation, and where people perhaps would also have a greater sense that they did have a responsibility to pay for their education in the end, rather than looking to others to pay for them.
Well, let's shift now. We'll come back to a little bit later on. There's a lot of things I want to unpack here with you. We've got time here, but I want to shift back to the history of the ANC a little bit here, founded early in the 20th century. Sol Plaatje's time, and the organization moved forward. It was a player for a long time. However, the Rivonia trial really eviscerated the leadership of the ANC. Most of it was locked up, wound up in Robben Island and elsewhere. O.R. Tambo, of course, Oliver Tambo, not wrapped up in that. He was able to be out of the country. But much of the leadership was eviscerated. And really from 1962 and thereabouts until the end of the 70s, the ANC was mostly not a major factor in South Africa, was it? The Pan-African Congress and others were much bigger actors. And a lot of people kind of forgot about the ANC, but the Western media played a large role, I think, in reminding people, because Winnie Mandela's campaign to highlight her husband being in prison. So for a long time, they really were out of the limelight until they went to Vietnam. Is that an accurate portrayal of the history?
I would think that is so. I would question whether the PAC was the black rival that had much.
Well, no, I'm just saying, they're just another group. Yeah,
there were other organizations,
right.
But the one that was the most important was actually in Carter, because the Chief Mangosuthu Buthelezi had a big following initially in KwaZulu-Natal and then also on the Reef, primarily Zulu, but not at all entirely Zulu. And the policies that he put forward resonated more with South Africans, who still tend to be rather pragmatic. He said, we can't afford economic sanctions. We need investment to come in. We need jobs to sustain people in the hard struggle against apartheid. And he also said, we're opposed to violence. We think we should try all the non-violent means before we turn to violence. We can only turn to violence as a last resort. And the non-violent means have by no means been exhausted, particularly as black consumer and labor power grows. So the ANC's policies were the diametric opposite, armed struggle and sanctions, and they didn't resonate with people. And hence the ANC really had nothing to do with the Soweto revolt. That was triggered by a different organization, an offshoot, perhaps you could say, of the PAC, the Black Consciousness Movement, which was formed by Steve Biko and others, and which basically had a message, black is beautiful and black people, you're on your own. You need to become proud of yourselves and your history and everything that you can contribute to the country so that you kind of overcome the mental subjugation that apartheid has subjected you to. And this had a powerful appeal, particularly to the youth. And it was a black consciousness rebellion against the imposition of Afrikaans as a language of instruction in the schools that led to the first big protest in Soweto, which the police then vastly exacerbated by shooting people without warning. And from there on, the country, as it were, exploded. But the ANC saw the opportunity, and so too very much did the Soviet Union. But like the ANC, the Soviet Union recognized that the ANC had very little domestic support. There was concern probably that it might have backed the wrong horse. So the ANC was sent off to Vietnam to learn there the formula for People's War and the way in which you could wrest power, not only from a dominant government, because already the National Party government had lost much of its will to rule, but particularly how you could trounce your rivals and emerge as the key player, which is what the National Liberation Front in Vietnam had done, and what the ANC, having absorbed the lessons from Vietnam, was able over time to achieve in South Africa as well. At the time when the ANC was unbanned in early 1990, the Inkatha Freedom Party had about 2 million members. The ANC was coming out of exile, coming out of being banned, but also coming out of having policies that hadn't resonated with people. So even in the late 1980s, when there was all the violence in the townships was accelerating and black policemen were being attacked and killed as part of the People's War, opinion surveys were asked, what do black people in the townships think of this? And the answer was that they were very unhappy about the violence, even the killing of black policemen who could certainly be seen as collaborators, that there was a strong sense that you should try other means to reach at the end of apartheid, a non-racial democracy. So the ANC really started on the back foot, and yet that is certainly not appreciated either in South Africa anymore, or I think in the rest of the Western world, because largely of successful propaganda depicting the ANC as the sole authentic representative of Black South Africa, playing down the role of other organizations, particularly in Inkatha, constantly giving more emphasis to the ANC. and very much skewing the real causes of the violence, which were rooted in that visit to Vietnam and the lessons about how you wage and win a people's war. But part of it was a propaganda strategy, and that required putting the blame on the third force, on obvious culprits, which people would find credible, on Inkatha, because its MPs had clearly been involved in violence, and on the police, who had such a bad record after the Soweto revolt. But they weren't the ones responsible for the most of the violence at that time. And the ANC was never held to account for its role in political assassinations, the necklacings of people who didn't want to take part in its campaigns. The way really in which it not only discredited, but really did destroy its black rivals so that it was able to take power in 1994 without the most important democratic check and balance, a real prospect of being voted out of power. So it had come from a real prospect of losing the first election to the situation where nobody contested for power for decades. And that gave it the opportunity to implement the National Democratic Revolution.
Well, and in fact, we've seen that now, even with the ANC no longer in the majority, they still act as if they have the majority. It's shocking. But if we go back to this history, you know, I visited the Apartheid Museum in Gold Reef City, I don't know, 20 some years ago, something like that, the first time I went. And it was reasonably balanced. I mean, there was Helen Suzman, the Black Sash movement, Steve Biko, the Black Consciousness movement, the Pan-African Congress, sanctions, the Inkatha Freedom Party. All these things were displayed in there. But each time I went back and visited, because I went back periodically, and I went 4 or 5 times, it became less and less the truth and more ANC propaganda. As I noticed, displays moved and changed, and it all became about how the ANC liberated South Africa. This is a fiction. I mean, this is an absolute fiction that they've convinced the world. And you're right. It's amazing how the world forgets just how little influence the ANC had, in part because of their violent measures and also because it was not something that was resonating with people. You touched on something earlier. You didn't use this word, but I'll use it. South Africans, black, white, and brown, tend to be conservative people by and large, whether they're Christians, Jews, or Muslims. They're not radical people, so to speak. People can be radicalized, but most people, they want to live in peace. They want to worship the way they want. They want to raise their family. They want to be successful. And this really ran against the grain of what it was all about for these folks. And to me, it's so frustrating to see this happen. And I guess we could touch on it now, but you mentioned the Truth and Reconciliation Commission earlier. And a lot of people like to hold up as a gold standard, but I think that much more scrutiny is needed on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So many black South Africans who committed horrible crimes were completely absolved of them, or just, you know, I mean, those who killed Amy Beale, they bludgeoned her to death, the young lady who was helping coloreds in the Cape Flats, not even a South African, because she was blonde and blue-eyed. They murdered her viciously. They spent a couple years in prison. And look, I'm not apologizing for the assassination of Chris Hani, but his murderer spent 4 decades in prison, or 3 decades plus in prison. There was no what's the word I'm looking for? The whole thing was skewed, and this isn't a white and black thing. There are white criminals who got away with things, but the problem is that the South African government held that up as this is a model for the world. We did such a great job. Rwanda should follow this, and Chile should follow this model. But the reality is here is a lot of dark times. And I remember reading, Ankie Krog's book, Country of My Skull, that she wrote a long time ago. It seemed to be an awful lot of, this went really well, but I don't think it went so well.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And in fact, I did write a book about it called rather arrogantly, perhaps, The Truth About the Truth Commission. It just seems such a pathway, perhaps, of trying to get to the essence of it, which was that they had not told the truth, and that there was a truth to be discovered. And you could find all sorts of weaknesses in the work that they did. In essence, they simply took a whole lot of hearsay as if it were gospel. They came to conclusions about accountability who had actually been to blame for killings at a time when they hadn't heard a quarter of the evidence, because the only really credible evidence that there was is what came out through the amnesty hearings, where you had a real examination of what people said and how much supporting evidence there was. But even that was very one-sided, because so many of the ANC people who'd been involved in the People's War, who'd really been responsible for heinous acts of violence, mostly against Inkatha people, but also against Black consciousness and some whites who'd experienced bomb blasts and the like, they were simply granted an indemnity. So they didn't even have to apply for amnesty. They were exonerated before 1994. And then once the Truth and Reconciliation process began, again, there was a very careful choice of culprits, huge attention on the role of some perpetrators, particularly if they were white policemen, and no attention on the role of other perpetrators, particularly if they had belonged to Umkhonto or the ANC self-defense units, which were the groups which I'm sure, as you know, the MK people who came back from exile were integrated into so-called self-defense units and became responsible for quite a lot of violence against the ANC's political rivals. But they too were never really, their crimes were never examined. It was a kind of sausage machine that dealt with the ANC people, and a very careful poring over the evidence when it came to the white policemen who had obviously done bad things, the Trustbeat massacre, the killing of many people, the killing of ANC activists. But that was blown out of proportion compared to all the deaths on the other side for which the ANC had been responsible. And what you really needed to do was a balanced look, which looked at the role in violence of everybody in proportion to how much violence they had actually been responsible for carrying out.
Well, in fact, that's no accountability in my view for the most part. Just a few tokens, small fry that they put up there that I'm talking about black South Africans of crimes, not going for the big fish because, of course, they were all embedded in the leadership structures and had big silver dollar eyeballs looking at the money coming their way and their power coming their way. I mean, there's been no accountability that I've seen yet for Quattro and the horrible things the ANC did to their own people in the camps in Angola, torturing and murdering them, let alone when we get to the People's War, especially in KwaZulu-Natal. And it's shocking to me, Dr. Jeffery, that people have forgotten about the horrors of necklacing. I mean, this was an unbelievably brutal practice, and this is something the ANC really fueled in KwaZulu-Natal. I mean, this was almost a daily occurrence, wasn't it, back then?
It was very common, yes. Probably not daily, but certainly.
Well, I'd say almost a day. It was a frequent, I should say frequent.
800 necklacings over a fairly short period of time in the 1980s. And of course, when the violence spread to the Reef, as it did in 1990, when the ANC was so determined to weaken the IFP, and the IFP had a very strong following in the Reef, and there are two areas of the country that really could determine the vote in the first all-race election, KwaZulu-Natal and what is now Gauteng. Those were the two biggest population centers. And in both of them, the IFP had a very strong following. So it was absolutely vital to the ANC that it should discredit and destroy the IFP in those two areas, so that hopefully people would either vote for them or would vote for anybody other than the IFP, which otherwise might really have done very well. And it succeeded to the extent that the IFP became almost the sort of eternal other, so discredited, people were terrified to be seen as having any link with it, because that could indeed bring the necklace to your home. And so you didn't want to be ever suspected of having any sympathy for the IFP.
Well, you keep mentioning the Reef. For my international audience, I presume you're talking about where the gold deposits are in the Highveld, the Gauteng area, correct?
That's correct. We called it the Pretoria Witwatersrand Vaal area, then PWV.
Yeah, well, that was the name of the province initially. That's what they called it. They didn't call it Gauteng initially. So, just for my international audience, it's very disheartening for me. And for me personally, I had a rare opportunity and I missed it by a day. What happened was when Mangosuthu Buthelezis's foundation was dedicated a couple of years ago, before he passed on. I had interviewed Velenkoli Gelabisa, who's now the leader of the party, and had interviewed several other candidates for the election in 2021 for the IFP, and I was invited, had a personal invitation to come to the opening of the foundation. He's an octogenarian. It's difficult to get the man's time, and they've been lining up an interview for me with Mangosuthu Buthelezi, which really would have been a great pleasure for me to get the chance to do that. Anyway, so I was in KZN, and by the time I got the information, the travel plan was laid out. I couldn't adjust it as there were multiple flights and such, and so I missed it by one day. I was in Howick instead of in Durban when they opened this thing, and so I missed it. Now, of course, since then he's passed on, but the IFP, they were a force. They were a force to be reckoned with, and he was widely respected. widely respected, excuse me. What disheartens me is how to this day the ANC still rubbishes Mangosuthu Buthelezi. They're disgusting, vile politicians in their comments about him as he passed and the social media. And this was a man whom, look, I'm not trying to play fanboy or play him up. This is a man who truly cared about South Africa, was focused on it. And the IFP, as you said, wasn't a Zulu exclusive organization. I know a lot of white South Africans who were members of IFP in the day, and until recently, some of them were. And as you said, up in Gauteng, they had quite a presence, but they've been eviscerated in Gauteng. They have like one person in government in the city council in Joburg, or maybe a couple more, but they're almost non-existent there. It's went from a situation where IFP had a broad base of support, certainly in those two provinces, and a potential for a greater presence around the country, to where it largely became a Zulu-based organization. And then, of course, took a further hit when Jacob Zuma was elevated to be deputy president and became president, and that really killed the IFP. Now, they made a bit of a comeback recently, but then once again, Jacob Zuma, forming Mkhonto we Sizwe party, is taking a hit on the IFP. So just as they're back on the ascendancy, they get a hit on an ethnicity base. I think the Inkatha Freedom Party is an interesting story that people probably should pay more attention to. Any thoughts on that?
No, I think that's absolutely right, because I think they were always far more pragmatic. And if we had had that essential criterion for democracy, the real prospect of a change in power, so that, perhaps you had the ANC in power for a period and then the IFP in power, you would not have had the scope for the National Democratic Revolution to be rolled out over 30 years. And you would have seen with the IFP, I think, a much more pragmatic approach, much less ideological, more focused on what would actually work and creating opportunities for people at the grassroots, getting the economy going, bringing in investment. And as you rightly said, South Africa had so much potential. It really could have expanded enormously, and its people could have seen growth at the levels of 5% or more over a number of years. But that potential was thwarted through the People's War because of the way in which 400 IFP leaders were killed. That was enough to make people very afraid of having any link to the IFP. And then the IFP was constantly blamed for the violence. So that kind of discrediting is also absolutely fatal to the reputation of a political party. You're now seen as having brought all this suffering to so many millions of people. So again, very successful propaganda on the part of the ANC, and very difficult to recover from the point of view of the IFP. And they never did recover. If the first election had been freer and fairer, perhaps they would have had a better, stronger following. But instead, it was so chaotic that in the end, it actually wasn't possible to compute an accurate result. And there were indications of considerable fraud. But again, there was nothing to be done about it in the circumstances. You couldn't rerun the election at that fraught moment in the country's history in order to get to a more accurate result. So we all just sort of accepted that it was broadly in line with what we'd expected and moved on.
Now, Dr. Jeffery, look, I'm going to have to push back. I can't accept that. I mean, I have it on authority from the New York Times and the Washington Post that the 1994 election, 27 April, was the freest, most fair, and obvious, clean, no corruption. It was. Look, I mean, I think that you've been misinformed about that election. Yeah, sorry. We can laugh about it now, but yeah, but I mean, think about it. I mean, look, the Western world and the media in particular play a large role in the history of South Africa in the 1980s going forward, especially. And then they just sort of disappear from the scene when Thabo Mbeki's gone and lose interest in South Africa. And look what's happened since then. We've seen basically kleptocracy in place and just a massive pilfering. I mean, if I just run through some of the scandals here. Also, we got Oilgate, Travelgate, Nkandla. What else we got here? The PP scandals, the Vrede dairy farm, the asbestos tender for Ace Magashule in the Free State. Zandile Gumeda finally back in the news with 178 counts of corruption, arrested 7 years ago, yet to face justice. Dr. Zwelin Kizi's digital vibes. I'm sorry, I'm running out of breath here with all these corruption scandals. I mean, that's just touching the surface. These are the ones we know about. And the criminal justice system has been so perverted that it favors the criminals. You know, the ANC's a bogus step aside policy that they never step aside. I mean, Cyril Ramaphosa, Munir Palapala, you know, stuffing cash in his furniture there at the game ranch, perverting the means of justice. I mean, and then we see, and people fall for this stuff. We see that he was absolved. You know, he was found innocent. No, he wasn't. The ANC, which controlled Parliament, did a bogus investigation and said he was not guilty of any ethics violations as a member of Parliament. He's never been charged criminally. There's been no investigation for what happened there. And the list goes on and on and on and on. It's horrific because a lot of South Africans simply don't see it. And it's frustrating. We've seen this play out so many times in so many places before. And for me, Dr. Jeffery, it's so heartbreaking. Because such potential, and I know South Africans, I know Tswana, I know Zulu, I don't know many Xhosa, I know a few, I know a lot of Afrikaners, I know Portuguese, I know English speakers, and almost every South African, well, there's always jerks everywhere, but most South Africans I met are just wonderful people, and they just want to get along. They don't live in this racialized world that's pushed by politicians, but they use it to divide people, and it's very effective.
Yes, I think it's been very effective, particularly against the up and coming party, the Democratic Alliance. If the IFP couldn't be a rival to the ANC anymore, then who else? And the Democratic Alliance was really the only contender, becoming the official opposition in 1999. But it's always been derided as a white party. It's the most racially mixed political party that we have by far. And yet the slur that it's a white party, that it will bring back apartheid if you were to vote for it, this kind of propaganda has again been far too effective in a situation where most people don't see the world as strongly divided into racial groups. But the media and many other commentators and politicians keep sort of banging that racial drum. And I think it does have some impact on people and their willingness to break out of what is safe and to go for an organization which is identified as a white party. That maybe is a difficult thing to do. And so we've also stymied the development of our democracy by preventing the most obvious contender coming up from getting the kind of support that it might have had without all this propaganda, without all these racist slurs.
Well, it goes even beyond that. You have these efforts to pervert the entire society with this racial narrative. I mean, you've got this whole concept, Bell Pottinger's white monopoly capital, that nonsense that was put out there, which basically is used, and for those who don't understand it or get it, they just see the result of it, and that people basically look and say, well, whites own all the businesses, and they're evil because they own all the businesses, and they're keeping us down. When in fact that's a distortion. Yeah, look, I mean, I'll be the first to be honest about South Africa's business climate. What I consider the oligarchies, the banking system, the retail system, really controlled by a few large holding companies, and it's not really a diverse economy in that respect. But this has been used as a cudgel to attack minorities in South Africa over policies that have failed that the ANC's put in place. They're the ones who've destroyed education. They're the ones that have pilfered from the economy. They're the ones that have not invested properly in infrastructure, and they're the ones that are continuing to go down the wrong path. And now we're at a situation where they have Section 25 of the Constitution, which allows for expropriation. And we see Ronnie Lamola go and have an interview with Deutsche Welle and completely lie about it. He said, well, America has the same thing. It's eminent domain. No, we have the same thing as Section 25. We do not have your new expropriation without compensation law, which allows for nil compensation. And here's a message to Ronnie Lamola. I've looked it up. The Oxford Dictionary, the Merriam Dictionary, the Webster's Dictionary, every one of them, the word nil means zero, nothing, zero, nada, yet nine, nix in the Bahnhof. It means nothing. So you can tell Donald Trump he doesn't know what he's talking about and he's not smart, but I think we can figure out what nil means. So what's happened now is that they've perverted this thing so much and lie about it, and people they buy it. Our eminent domain is not the same. The Fifth Amendment to the Constitution guarantees that you must be compensated if your property is taken for public purpose. Must be compensated. That's the basic law of the Constitution. That's what's in your Constitution. Now they have a law that's unconstitutional that says you can give nil compensation. And this is the kind of nonsense, the perverted logic that people are using in South Africa, and people fall for it. And I would argue that one of the reasons for it is because people are so desperately poor, they're tired of not having things, and they're being told things that sound good to them, and they believe it. And that's probably what prompts the land invasions in Seshowe and East London. It's really disheartening because it completely perverts the reality, and the propagandists have won. I
think it's actually the dimensions here that are worth unpacking.
Sure.
I think There's a perception very much that people are swept up by this kind of rhetoric and that they believe it. But Franz Cronier and his Social Research Foundation has just brought out a new opinion poll, which indicates that 66% of people are not in favor of the Expropriation Act and the idea of nil compensation. So that obviously it's going to be a majority of Black people who've come to that conclusion. But you will have organized land invasions. And there again, the poor can just be, as it were, pawns in this game. It's very easy to organize a land invasion among people who are desperate for accommodation. So again, yes, one must always look back to the root of all this, which is the ANC's pursuit of the National Democratic Revolution, which requires that we move closer and closer to government control and then state ownership as part of a socialist system, that you kind of you remove people from the capitalist system and make them ever more dependent upon the state. And perhaps that might work if your state was reasonably efficient, but here we have huge inefficiency, vast corruption, and absolutely no possibility of it working at all. Simply, we see the crushing of the opportunities that might otherwise exist if we were attracting investment, if we were growing our economy, if we were generating many more jobs. People would have so much more scope to cater for their own needs. Instead, they're being pulled by the ANC, by the National Democratic Revolution, into this situation of dependency on the state, where they are open to manipulation by politicians and by people who will orchestrate a land invasion for their own purposes.
Well, I have no doubt that the polls are correct in surveys. You talk about Franz Cronier, and you said 66% of people oppose it. I have no doubt that that's true, and that goes in line with what I said. Most South Africans are rational people, not interested in this nonsense. But 34% is a disturbing number that would be in favor of it. That's a pretty disturbing number. 3% would be okay with me, but 34%, that's a lot of people who would favor that.
Yeah, it was a bit less than that, but only about 6% were uncertain. So the remainder, yes, were in favor.
Okay. I'll quibble. 26%. Okay. But still, a quarter of the population, but I mean, it's a consequence of a number of factors here. But it is a bit disturbing here, what's been going on here. So as far as the outlook now, I mean, we have a situation where everything is just being distorted. So, for instance, the press in South Africa, the elites, the rich liberal whites, the black supremacists, the government, the media, all the media, almost in lockstep, are talking about Donald Trump demanding things in South Africa and threatening South Africa. I have the executive order here. There are no threats. There are no promises. Donald Trump simply said, we're not giving you $500 million a year anymore because you're working against our national interest. And oh, by the way, we're going to open up a refugee program to people we feel you're persecuting. To me, I'm being a little cheeky here, but at the base of it, this is correct. These are internal matters for the United States. That's our money. We choose to give it to people. It's not your money, not you, Dr. Jeffery, but not South Africa's money. And oh, by the way, it doesn't even go to the ANC. That money almost entirely goes to third parties, NGOs, contractors who deliver services, whether it's HIV or primary school education, which is a very small portion of it, or agricultural things. So it's our choice. And what irritates me on this end of the Atlantic and also on that side is that people feel we were obliged to provide this. The PEPFAR, for instance, was the emergency plan. A 5-year plan to spend $15 billion to help countries get on a solid footing to take over their responsibility. I ran PEPFAR programs all over Africa. It's been 22 years and still suckling off the American teat. And then what we see now is that America's threatening South Africa. No, we're not. We're just pulling that aid and it's gone. Trump didn't say, if you do this, we'll give it back. No, he didn't say that. Maybe there's a possibility it comes back. But the reality that people are missing here, and it's not being shared in South Africa, is most people go about, well, Afrikaners, it's a white thing, and this isn't true. None of them are oppressed. Nobody's a victim. Let's set that aside. That's a distraction in the executive order, in my view. That's a big issue, particularly for a lot of people in my audience, but that's a distraction. The real meat of that executive order were the two things that followed. The International Court of Justice and South Africa's decision, in my view, and I've said this since the outset at the behest of Tehran, to go to, and I have no evidence of it, but that's my analysis, to go to the ICJ. which is really diametrically opposed to U.S. interest in Israel. Even under the Biden administration, that was the case. But more importantly, it's cooperation with Tehran for commercial, military, and nuclear arrangements. It's right there in the executive order. I mean, it's not classified. And I can tell you that it's far worse than what's being said there. The list of insults and grievances that the ANC has made against the United States over years. Just a couple years ago, Cyril Ramaphosa running around, vaccine apartheid, vaccine apartheid, lying about that when he signed up for the UN's failed COVAX scam instead of getting the South African pharmaceutical industry to participate in the drug trials with U.S. drug manufacturers. So they refused to do it. And then on top of that, we, the Europeans and the Americans, gave $711 million to Aspen Pharmacare to make vaccines. My point is that there's a lot going on here, but the U.S. is being rubbished in South Africa because it's a white thing and Trump is misinformed and we're sanctioning South Africa. There are no sanctions. We haven't even pulled South Africa out of AGOA. That's incredibly generous. South Africa has access to the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, and we get no reciprocity. We're not even asking for it. 75% tariffs on our poultry imports because South Africa is upset, but we don't do that to you. There are no sanctions. The U.S. is not attacking South Africa. It's a matter of perception, and it's being blown completely out of proportion. Now, that's not entirely objective, but 100% accurate. Any thoughts?
And I think you're right when Ramaphosa complains that he won't be bullied by the US. Well, I think you're 100% correct that how the US chooses to use its own money is the US is its right to decide. And of course, I think also that President Trump was right to flag those three issues. One can argue about the details, of course, but the Expropriation Act will be enormously damaging to all South Africans, black and white, to all economic prospects in this country of prosperity and moving ahead. That there is these race-based laws, as we said at the beginning, they're things that help the elite and hugely harm the great majority of poor people. And it's good to flag this as a problem. The ICJ claim, I've done a little bit of research on the question of Israel as an apartheid state. And though, of course, the ICJ claim is based on the genocide, it also very often refers back to Israel being an apartheid state, and now it's taken the further step to committing genocide in Gaza. So it seems to me highly ideological. I don't know about the other issues that you talk about. There's very little information here about whether we have any nuclear links to Iran. There's been denial by some people who you think might know. But yeah, fundamentally, it's America's choice where they put their money. And I think that the ANC has been riding so roughshod over the people of South Africa for such a long time that if there is a powerful actor in the world who calls it out and says this is a bad thing, then I appreciated that. I thought it was very important that some attention should be drawn to the risks in the expropriation bill, to these policies that so harm the country. And to the fact that South Africa's foreign policy should be geared towards its national interest, not its long-standing ideological ties to Russia or China or Iran.
Well, I agree 100%. All that plays a role. But what's interesting, let's get to the expropriation without compensation. This is a fantasy world. I mean, this is not South Africa of 1911 where there were 4 or 5 million people and you could divide land up and have traditional ownership of land and the chief would decide you could graze here and you could farm there. We're talking 63 million people in a country with 13% of the land is arable. I mean, this nonsense of abrogating property rights is not going to work. And we can look at countries where it's gone badly. Zimbabwe, a good example there, and the lies that were told about farmland there. And then also we can look at success stories. Peru. Peru was a country where basically there was a peasant class in the 20th century. And finally, what the government did is they said, enough of this nonsense. We're living in abject poverty. How do we fix this? Well, economists said, well, these peasants have no collateral. Why don't you give them title to the land they're occupying, since most of it belongs to the state, and then they'll have collateral. And son of a gun, they had collateral. And they could go and, look, I have this plot, and I want to borrow money to start the equivalent of a spaza or a tuck shop or something like that, or I want to start a quilting business, and the banks could take a risk because now there's collateral that they can go after if they aren't repaid. And Peru's economy flourished with the extension of private property rights. South Africa wants to go in the opposite direction. Of course, MK and EFF are even worse. They want to expropriate it and put it in the hands of the politicians. Of course, that to me, that's just traditional African model where the chief is responsible for who gets what. But that's just a model for abuse. I mean, I've seen this all over West Africa. Ghana has major land tenure issues because they have a mix of things. They have private property rights, but they also have this traditional chief thing. And traditional chiefs are the ones who decide who gets what and who doesn't get what. And if you fall afoul, if you don't let your 14-year-old daughter sleep with a chief, then you're off the land. I mean, it's really a system ripe for abuse. And I'm extending it quite a ways here for South Africa. But the point is that without private property rights, you cannot have a functioning economy in the 21st century, let alone leap into the fourth industrial revolution, which is where South Africa needs to be headed, with proper education and robotics and AI and programming and genetics and things like that. But instead, there are no rails. The ports are the worst in the world. There's potholes all over the place. It's really sad what's been going on here. And EWC is just going to make it exponentially worse, in my view.
Absolutely. And I'd just like to flag the point and then come back to it later, that the Expropriation Act is not only about land. That's one of the great misperceptions that have been created. But in terms of land, it also it brushes aside, as does the ANC, of course, how much has actually been achieved. We have 9.75 million Black households who own their own homes, but very often they don't have title deeds. So yes, if they could be given title deeds, this would make a huge difference. We also have actually quite a lot of land which has been transferred since 1994. The most accurate statistics, I'm afraid I find myself grasping for. It's about
3.9 million hectares of land have been purchased by the government at a cost of about 68 billion rand.
Yeah, it's been much more than that over time. If you look at not only restitution, but also redistribution, and also at land purchases where Black people have bought land on the open market without the help of the government, the amount of land which has been acquired by Black people is considerable. But you're 100% right. Many of the so-called beneficiaries of land reform are on state land, and it is the government's policy not to give them title deeds. If they are able to claim land of which they were wrongly dispossessed in the past under apartheid, then they don't have the option to get individual title. They become folded into community property associations, or the land goes to a tribal authority. If they're on redistribution land, then the state keeps the ownership, and it's willing to grant them leases. In theory, those leases can be for as long as 30 years. In practice, they are often caretaker tenancies, which last for just a few months at a time, which is one of the most vulnerable forms of title you can possibly have. So people can't invest in the land that they're trying to work without risking the loss of their investment if they put up fences or whatever. So it was also recognized by the government itself back in 2017 when they set up a high-level panel of parliament under former President Kgalema Motlanthe, that land acquisition costs are not the problem, not the reason why land reform is going slowly or failing. It's firstly because the government won't give them title. Secondly, because it doesn't support farmers. It seems to assume that once you have a plot of land, that's all you need for success, when of course farming is a difficult business, which requires many more inputs. And fundamentally, they have an ideological view that what they're trying to recreate is peasant farming.
That's what they want.
That's what they want.
The rest of the world is reducing. The rest of the world is reducing the number of people working in agriculture. In America, less than 1% of Americans work in agriculture. Modern techniques, automation, now other things coming along. Whereas in South Africa, they made a plan. They said we want to put 1 million people basically in subsistence agriculture, which makes them perpetually stuck in poverty. Subsistence agriculture is not the solution. These kids shouldn't be learning how to be, farmers on a hectare plot surviving. They should be learning how to do robotics.
Exactly. And yet their policy, the 1 hectare, 1 household policy, did assume that all land in the country that was in any way under state control, including the land that might be taken into state custodianship in the future, would in time be divided into these 1 hectare plots. And then people would be organized in cooperatives, and, they would have 1 hectare of land and 2 dairy cows, as if many of the arid parts of the country can support 2 dairy cows on a small piece of land. And then it would all be, prosperity and success. It's so out of sync with reality, so out of sync with the modern world, and out of sync with what South Africans want. Again, opinion polling shows that land reform is the least of people's priorities. And the ANC is well aware of this. Frans Cronje will also say that polling that he's aware that the ANC itself has done identifies land reform as the 13th priority of South Africans, which means it's not priority at all. And if there are 12 other things that are more important to people.
Well, I think that's a fair argument if there's 12 things more important. But that gets to the crux of the matter, something that I've been talking about for years, and I'm going to put on the screen. You can't see it, but you know the answer here. And that is namely that what is happening is that this is not about land. This is a distraction in my view. This is not what it's about. It's about property. Here is the Constitution in front of you, Section 25, Paragraph 4. Section B, property is not limited to land, folks. Look at that screen. You can see it right there. That has always been the case. And so what that means is that this law will allow them to expropriate your pension funds and your Krugerrands and your flat and your Bucky and anything else that they want to go at. And here's the truly frightening prospect of all this, Dr. Jeffery, which I'm sure you're 100% aware. This law is promulgated so that it's not simply the national authorities that can do this, which would mean you might be safe unless you're a prominent person, but it's the provincial and the municipal authorities. So the rotating chair of musical chairs in Nelson Mandela Bay in Cabrera, Port Elizabeth, where the UDM betrays the Democratic Alliance and then Athol Trollop is out, and then we get this guy in from the ANC and we get this guy in from the EFF. That nonsense, every one of those mayors in that council come along and go, you know what? Your coffee shop is needed for a meeting hall for the public. So we're taking it away from you. Now, when you have just and fair compensation, which is called for in the Constitution, which I just showed to my audience, you can expropriate property in the public interest, but you've got to pay people fairly according to the Constitution. So you've got to reach a price and they've got to get some kind of compensation. It's got to be in the public interest. But with the new law, you don't have to pay them. You just have to say it's in the public interest. So there's a process and they say there's safeguards, but that's nonsense because the courts, if it goes to court, who appoints judges? The state. Who do they owe their fealty to? To the state. Who pays their paycheck? The state. Oh, and it could go to an arbitrator. But who appoints the arbitrator? The state. And who pays the state? So the point here is that the landowner or the property owner is at no advantage or complete disadvantage in this negotiation. We saw it with Akalan Broderie. That's exactly what happened with them. They eventually sold out, and now that land hasn't even gone to the claimants. The claimants didn't get it. It belongs to Saudi Prince now. The coal company never even did any coal mining there. So this is an incredibly abusive situation. Now, if it's zero compensation, it works very well. So next year, when the government has a shortfall because it couldn't raise the value-added tax or they couldn't raise income tax, well, we need to take 10% of everybody's pension funds. We need to expropriate that. But when you expropriate for zero compensation, it's easy to take money and assets. It's a lot harder to take those assets when you have to give fair compensation because how do you compensate 100 Rand for 100 Rand? Well, you give 100 Rand. So it's an exercise of nothing. But now there's no compensation. So you take the 100 Rand and you're going to be happy with it. That's the scary part about this. Is that something I think you probably agree with that?
I think, again, one must just look at some of the fine print because it is worth looking at. The nil compensation does apply to land. It's not clear whether it applies to the improvements as well. And obviously, the moment it applies to the improvements as well, then you are in very much a situation you're talking about. An asset that has considerable value, you can get zero for. But it doesn't formally apply outside of the land context. So the pension funds, the savings, and so on, you get what will be much less than the value. And it may be that the definition of expropriation, that's now going to get a bit technical, will allow them to pay nothing. Let's take for the custodianship concept, because the ANC has already taken custodianship of all water resources. So people used to have riparian common law rights to water. And then they got, under the National Water Act of 1998, an intimation that all water resources were now vested in the state as trustee or custodian, and they could get a water use license, which would never last more than 40 years. It would be reviewed every 5 years. In other words, complete uncertainty on one of the most important aspects. But what property rights they did have, their common law rights to water, were simply taken away without compensation. And the same thing happened when mineral resources, which 2/3 of which had been privately owned, were vested in the custodianship of the state. And there a case did come to court, and it was extremely badly decided by the Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court drew a distinction. It said you have the compulsory acquisition of ownership by the state, and that's expropriation, and for that you should get compensation. But you have the assumption of custodianship by the state as well. And that's a different thing. And there the state is merely depriving you of property and you don't get compensation. There's no right to compensation, not a cent, because it's not an expropriation. So they have put into the Expropriation Act a definition which is supposed to build on that Constitutional Court definition, which emphasizes compulsory acquisition by the state. So if the state doesn't acquire ownership, if it takes custodianship in some future statute, the argument is going to be it doesn't count as an expropriation. There's no compensation to be paid. Custodianship, I think, can only apply to natural resources. So again, land, but probably also the improvements on it will be an issue. But it wouldn't apply, for example, to patent rights. But on the other hand, with patent rights, as they've already said, well, they could insist on a compulsory license and they could make the royalties very low or sort of really minuscule. And there would be no expropriation because the state would not have acquired ownership of the patent. It would just have required the patent holder to grant a compulsory license to somebody to use its product. So that's the thinking that underpins this definition of expropriation. And that is how this definition could actually morph into a whole number of what most countries in the world would recognize as indirect expropriations. Most bilateral investment treaties would say whether an expropriation is direct into the ownership of the state or indirect, some other way the state has taken control of it, you're still entitled to compensation. But we are trying to draw this rather fake distinction between a direct expropriation as something that will merit some compensation and an indirect one, which won't count as an expropriation at all, and where there'll be no question of compensation.
Well, that's where I'm going with this. You know, you were correct that this law doesn't specifically say those are their assets, but I have no trust and confidence whatsoever in this government. I mean, to me, it's anathema, the concept of custodianship. I mean, governments didn't exist. We as people walked around in bands of small groups and we defended ourselves, and then we formed polities to represent our common interests for national defense and for, you know, dealing with transgressors, to punish transgressors in courts and things like that, and to keep society safe. We didn't form polities to steal our natural rights and to steal what's under our feet. This is, to me, this is absolutely insane. Look, in America, you own what is below you and what runs across the course of your land. Unless, of course, someone purchased those mineral rights. That does happen. I mean, when we had a farm in rural Appalachia, we didn't have the mineral rights, but part of the contract that was done before we bought it, because the farm was parceled out, it was a huge farm, and parceled out, it was that we would get the natural gas that came off of the oil well that was across the street. So we had gas for years. You know, we didn't have to pay for energy because it came off that. It was free, but that was part of it. But normally you get the water, normally you get the mineral rights, and the fact that people don't own that, the state owns it, just is a massive source of corruption. You know, whether you award contracts to corrupt friends and partners and make them rich, or you simply deny the people who have the wealth. I mean, look, I mean, the Bafokeng have somehow done well because they've somehow been able to get their hands on the revenue from the platinum that is dug out from that area of Northwest. But most South Africans don't benefit from the mines at all. And this, especially the people, the landowners. And this, the thing for me, taking the water custodianship, it's comical, because if it wasn't for the Highlands Water Project, which was never finished, thank you, ANC, but the Highlands Water Project, people would be, you know, dying of starvation, or not starvation, of dehydration, I should say, dehydration in Gauteng. That water doesn't belong to the ANC. It came from Lesotho. Someone's paying for it. You know, why does the state of custodianship over water coming out of Lesotho? It's insane. I mean, this is not how you run an economy. This is not how you increase wealth. This is not how you enrich people and lift them out of poverty. It's completely opposite, 180 degrees.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And I think that what they're trying to do is to pretend that there is no difference between, say, you know, the unsevered gold deep beneath the ground and the gold that's been mined and brought up. Well, obviously there is. And as soon as you have something which human ingenuity and money and effort has gone into creating, you can't treat it the same as if it were purely a natural resource. You need to draw that distinction. And when they try to take custodianship of land and then try to argue that the improvements on the land are part of the land, and so they can take custodianship of those too, it's a very false argument, because the improvements obviously are not a natural resource, and they were not created by nature or the creator. They were brought into being by human effort and money and enterprise in many instances. And that can't just be taken without compensation, without breaching our constitution and being at odds with the views that Western democracies have, the basis on which successful economies thrive, which is the recognition of property rights.
Well, you talk about this. I look at Zimbabwe and Nicklin in the southeastern part of the country. It was largely not farmed, just grazing, not well irrigated. And commercial farmers after the Second World War irrigated that, fertilized that land, turned it very productive. And many places put drip irrigation, put orchards in. None of this was there. These are all improvements. Even things growing land were improvements that made it prosperous and fertile. And when the land was taken, there was nothing for it. And now it's just all destroyed because of the way that they parceled it out. And I have very strong concerns that that's going to be something similar that happens in South Africa. I want to go back to something from a little bit ago. You were talking about the title deeds. This is a concept that I've been talking about for years. South Africa is kept poor because of intentional decisions by the African National Congress government, specifically not issuing title deeds to the people living in RDP housing and government-owned land. That is what I call dead capital. Those people could have tens of billions of dollars of capital that's available to them, not in their pocket, but that's a resource that has value that banks can go, aha, okay, I want money for a sponsor shop. It's dead capital. They can free up billions of dollars. That alone would juice the economy in the short term as people who have entrepreneurial skills, who are poor but want to achieve something, are able to access capital that right now they can't even get their hands on.
Exactly, yeah. So it's one of the great tragedies that title deeds have not been rolled out. And every now and then the ANC does talk about doing it, but the effort is always very small because it is against their ideology. Their aim is to remove property rights, not extend them. And this is tragic for the people of South Africa, particularly those who were barred from property rights in the apartheid era. And one of the good things that the National Party finally did was, as I mentioned earlier, to have a great housing sale in Soweto, where people could buy the houses of which they had been tenants, living as tenants for so many years, for small amounts of money. And then in the 1990s, the National Party government did something else that was useful. They passed an act called the Upgrading of Informal Land Tenure Act, ULTRA. And it converted all those inchoate titles into freehold. And sadly, that has also been reversed. And you can't blame it directly on the ANC, but perhaps indirectly there is some link because it's been done by the Constitutional Court. And we have a Constitutional Court that's not particularly sympathetic to property rights, is far too concerned about an ANC version of transformation rather than thinking about what is practical, what will be successful in helping people get ahead. What the Constitutional Court did, and in response again to maybe an issue that is difficult, a woman complained that when this process took place, title always went to the head of the household, who was always seen as a man at that time. And so she, as a woman, had lost out. But the response of the court was not to try and find some sensible solution, but to invalidate all those titles and say, right, we'll start again.
Shaking my head. I can see this. It's like, well, I mean, just an aside from this, you had during the COVID. Are you still there? Oh yeah, I thought we froze there. During the COVID nonsense, we had the tourism relief fund that was created and had to go to historically disadvantaged, in other words, Black South Africans. And I mean, it was a token amount. It was like less than $5,000 US. That's not going to save a lodge. That's not going to save a tour group. It will help people who have combis that are running a little taxi service and stuff like that, or souvenir vendors on the side of the road. To me, it was just a silly idea anyway, but they were trying. But they excluded all these different organizations that went to the North Gauteng High Court, and they said that it was in line with the Constitution. It wasn't racist because even though it excluded minorities. And then eventually went to the Constitutional Court, which overturned that decision. Yeah, it went to the Constitutional Court or Supreme Court, but went to one of those two, and they overturned it. But by then, all the money was gone, so it was a fait accompli. I mean, and that's what the intent was. Put it out there, all the money be gone. Okay, well, you're right. Now everyone gets access, but the program's been shut down because we have no money. It's really disheartening to see where we're going here. But back to the National Democratic Revolution, because that was where all this is tied into that. So in many ways, I think it's fair to argue that the ANC's vision of the National Democratic Revolution is playing out in spades, courtesy of the Government of National Unity. I mean, let's see what's happened since the GNU has been formed. The Bella Bill, which interferes dramatically in oppressive fashion with local rights for education, and also creates a contingency where parents could be put in prison for their children being truant. That's hardly seems fair, because a lot of parents whose kids don't show up in school are poor parents, black parents who can't get their kids to school because they can't afford the transport or the school fees or a combination of factors. Now you've put the threat of law over them that they can be imprisoned if they don't do something. And on top of that, first language instruction being English when 94% of the country doesn't speak English as a first language. That's insane. To me, it's shocking that Zulu, Venda, Xhosa, Tswana, and Basotho people are not like, wait a second, we want to learn in our language. Why are you making us learn English? So Bella comes out, just roll over. So Saviwe Garuba from the DA doesn't go to the signing ceremony. Woo, that's going to change everything. And then after that, we have what I call the black tax, the 3% corporate tax proposal of Parks Tao, in which after profit taxes, they have to take another 3% to put into 100 billion rand slush fund, which we know is not really going to go to black businesses, but often in the pockets of senior officials. And now expropriation of that compensation. It seems to me that the National Democratic Revolution is not only moving along, but it's picking up pace, with the ANC having only a plurality in government, not the majority.
I think that's correct, yes. You could argue that all of these bills were enacted by Parliament in the sixth Parliament before the ANC lost its majority. But of course, I think what is really crucial is what the ANC itself has said about the National Democratic Revolution at this point. And President Cyril Ramaphosa, at the ANC's anniversary statement on the 8th of January, made it clear that the GNU is just a tactic. It's a short-term way of making sure that we remain in power and we can keep implementing the NDR. And then, in time, we'll get back our majority, and it'll be just as it was before 2024. And another very senior person in the ANC, Mamoloko Kubai, has talked about it being an equivalent of Lenin's new economic policy. That when the ANC suffered the setback of winning only 40% in the election, it reached back into time and saw that Lenin in 1921, when he was really worried that his party might actually be ousted from power in Soviet Russia because the economy was in such dire straits, there was so much resistance, he pretended that they were actually disillusioned with socialism, that they were moving towards capitalism. He invited investors back in. And after 8 years, the economy had recovered, their position was much more secure, and then the experiment ended, and the people who had invested lost a great deal of what they had put in. So that Mamlaka Kubai can be quite overt about saying, well, this is like Ramaphosa, this is just a stratagem. We haven't given up on the NDR in any way. We don't accept that we're not in power and that we have to rethink our policies. We're just going to find ways of doing it anyway. And it is very difficult, I think, for the DA to resist, partly because, as they said for so many months before the election, if the ANC were to go into a coalition with the EFF and the MK groups, MK when it came up, this would be a doomsday coalition. This would destroy the economy, and one can see that it would be absolutely devastating. So they kind of promised to save the country from that, which meant that they then had set themselves up to take part in the GNU, almost irrespective of what they were offered by the ANC. And unfortunately, the statement of intent on the basis of which they voted Cyril Ramaphosa as president again was far too vague, far too uncertain, and in the end, of course, thoroughly abused by the ANC, which made sure that despite having won only 40% of the vote, it got 65% of the ministers. And it got 83% of the deputy ministers. And the DA, which had won 22%, got, I think it was 18% of the ministers and 13% of the deputies. So in the cabinet, it's to begin with, the whole situation was skewed, with the ANC acting as if they actually hadn't lost power. It was really, Cyril Ramaphosa was praised for having accepted the result of the election. But I think it's certainly arguable he didn't accept the result of the election. He just found a way of bypassing it. And that is not seen or acknowledged adequately.
I agree 100%, and that was my analysis here. They are acting as if they won the election, and they're just using this as a tool to achieve their means, and they've openly said it. But I said that before they even did it. You know, I disagree wholeheartedly with the DA's assessment. I think they're wrong, and I stick to that. Before the election, I made predictions of what could happen, and actually in November of 2021, I predicted the ANC. This before the rise of MK, based on other factors. But as the truth changed, I kept my analysis because I felt it was still accurate. I predict the ANC would come in at 38 to 42% at best. They came in at 40% of the vote. So I hit that. I'll crow about that because I made that prediction after the municipal elections based on what I saw there. But the point here is that before the election, I drew up these potential coalitions, and I called it the Doomsday Coalition back months before the election. And I talked about a possibility, but I said that it was highly unlikely. And the reason I said it was highly unlikely, there's no way that the ANC is going to accept MK in a coalition with it. They might vote with them on certain bills, but they're not going to accept in a coalition because Jacob Zuma would eat the ANC from the inside. That would be the end of the ANC. It's already collapsing in every imaginable way, as you can imagine. So that's never going to happen. That wasn't a realistic expectation. I think the DA either didn't know that or they used it as an excuse to say that's why we're going to go in government. So I disagree with that assessment. Now EFF, unlikely. Julius Malema, I know that Ramaphosa doesn't like him at all, but they're convenient foil. They're little foot soldiers of the ANC who can say and get away with the things the ANC wants to do publicly, but they do it. And they didn't get 10%. So they could have brought them in, but they still would need a few smaller parties. It's possible, but I think unlikely because Malema would try to use a platform and he would make himself a thorn in government quicker than you can imagine. So to me, the party that had all the power in this negotiation, the party that should have demanded things or there would be no government. Because what happens with no government? Well, it's a parliamentary system. The ANC can rule as a plurality party. They just won't get anything through. They won't be able to control anything. And people forget that. They think you have to have 50 plus 1. You have to have 50 plus 1 to secure your vote, but you don't have to have it to lead a government. Look at Europe. We got tons of parliaments where people have 30% and they're running a government without a coalition. It doesn't work very well, but it does. And to me, that's the best option. If the ANC can't get any legislation through, they can't oppress liberty. So I was okay with that. But back to that. So the DA entered this negotiation after the election. I was in South Africa covering elections. I went to 13 polling stations or 14 on election day in Western Cape, including 5 in Khayelitsha. And when I covered these events and afterwards an analysis while I was still in South Africa, I said, listen, the DA has the power here. They're the party that rules here because the ANC needs them. They can't cobble together a smaller alliance with all these other parties and achieve what they need to get 50 plus 1. So the DA should go into this. And then when they came out of it, they had nothing in the security cluster. They don't control the military. They don't control the police, justice, foreign ministry, finance, none of that. All they got were broken ministries that need to be fixed, so the ANC can take the credit for later on. Look, Home Affairs works now. Now you can get your passport in a few days. Look at this. Now education's fixed. Not that it will be, but my point is that the DA, I don't know, I think they were deluding themselves, and I don't know why or how, but they, in my view, held all the power. They should have said, and I said this time, we're not going to go into government unless you give us this. But the ANC got what they wanted. They rolled over in all their public statements. Fikile Mbalula running around, spouting off stuff all the time, and Ramaphosa. The ANC is not only not chastised and chastened, they are empowered by what's going on in here. And it's quite frightening because you talk about something. Now they run around and when people, they throw out and attack people with a slur, well, they oppose transformation. Well, if transformation is the communist oppression and the poverty for millions of people, I oppose that. That's not transformation. If transformation is uplifting everybody and treating everybody equally so that no one lives in poverty and getting more people into sectors where they should have an opportunity, then I'm for it. But that's not what transformation is under the ANC.
Exactly. Yes, I agree with you. I do think that the DA kind of painted itself into a corner by talking about how they would have to rescue the country from the Doomsday Coalition. That at the end of the day, they could also have pursued a confidence and supply agreement where they wouldn't go into coalition with the ANC, but they would, if they thought the budget was good enough, that they would vote for it. That they would vote to get certain people into positions of authority. And they would help the ANC in motions of no confidence. I think that would have given them much more autonomy. As it is, they're now in this situation where they are seen as weak, inconsequential. They're sure to be hemorrhaging support, I would think, among Francis figures are interesting.
That poll shocks me,
France
and
is
in
showing
fact,
that they're still at 25%, so they've held.
yeah,
And
that poll, I'm
the
actually. I'm sorry, Dr. Jeffrey. We talked over each other. That was my fault. But that poll that you're referring to, the SRJ poll, I'm actually talking to the pollster on Thursday. I'm going to interview him on Thursday because I saw the poll and I didn't realize it was for them because it was small print at the bottom. And every major party has declined except the DA, and I'm finding that hard to fathom. So we're going to talk about. I mean, like I said, I didn't know who did the poll initially, but Franz put the guy in touch with me, and so I'm going to have him on Thursday because I'm looking at scratching my head because I can tell you anecdotally. I mean, I've got 50,000 people that tune in this program, not all simultaneously. Usually the big broadcast will get 5,000 or 6,000 here. But, people who are DA supporters are banning them in droves who come to my program. Now, to be fair, that's not a representative sample of the voting base in South Africa. That's clearly people who glom onto my worldview or my presentation of things. So I realize that's not representative, but a lot of people are very angry. So I'm shocked to see that poll say that the DA gained 3% since the elections. And I'm not shocked to see the ANC drop to 32 and MK dropped by 3 points and everybody dropped. But it is puzzling. So I'm going to have them on Thursday. But you're right. In that poll, the DA has gone up by 3 percentage points, which seems counterintuitive.
Yes, it does. But it may be partly, that's as Francis indicated, that there were a lot of people who were undecided. But perhaps some people who were undecided felt that the DA at this point was a better option than the ANC. So some of the support that left the ANC might have gone to the DA as trying to do better. But their traditional support base, I would think, is deeply worried that the ANC has been running rings around them.
Well, I agree with you 100% here. It's people just get poorer and poorer. It just gets worse and worse. And the fat cats seem to be living fine, living high off the hog. It's always been frustrating for me. Look, in the interest of full disclosure, I mean, we've only talked for a short time here. We don't know each other before this. I am all in with capitalism. It's lifted hundreds of millions of people, billions of people out of abject poverty. Markets and economies that weren't capitalist, that have adopted tenets of capitalism, free market capitalism, like Vietnam and the Chinese communists, have flourished as a consequence of adding those things. Now, there are other reasons for that, but we see where free market capitalism gets not a free hand, but at least gets incorporated in some respect. People are lifted out of poverty. Property rights and free markets, protection of patents and copyright and trademarks, all those things play a key role in increasing wealth. And everyone has risen up from poverty. In America, we have people in poverty, but poverty here for most people isn't like poverty in Bangladesh or poverty in Kailicha. It's a very different sort of poverty. But people compare poverty levels. But the bottom line here is that socialism and communism just don't work. It's never worked anywhere. Look at how wealthy Venezuela was as a country. There may have been an elite that was getting a lot of resources, but the poor weren't eating cats and dogs and rubbish out of rubbish bins. But that's what Venezuela is today, thanks to Chavez and all the nonsense going on there. And instead of, embracing that, the ANC is just dead set on their NDR. They're dead set on their state control of everything, despite the fact that they've destroyed South African Airways, they've destroyed Eskom, Transnet, Airports Company South Africa's even a disaster, can't even provide fuel at OR Tambo for international flights. That's embarrassing. The fact that there's only one refinery left in South Africa, and for a period of 9 months there were no refineries in South Africa till they reopened the one north of Cape Town. I mean, this is just insane. It's completely broken, and many South Africans just don't want to see it. That's what frustrates me.
Yeah, I think, again, perhaps the media doesn't do enough of a role of really unpacking all these issues. I think they tend to give the ANC a too easy a ride on many issues, and they never talk about the National Democratic Revolution, which I think is one of the greatest failures of all, because this is what drives the ANC. This is what explains what seem to be extraordinary policies and decisions that the ANC makes that have no logical and likely good economic outcome. So no logical base, no likely good outcome. It's the ideology that drives them. They picked it up from the Soviet Union in the 1960s. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Joe Slovo asked has socialism failed, and he came to the conclusion that it hadn't, as did many other socialist parties around the globe, who said it was just badly applied in the Soviet Union. It became too bureaucratic, whereas what they wanted was democratic socialism, and that had never even been tried. So they would keep on pursuing democratic socialism. And as Chris Hani said, this means that, in the end, the state will meet all your needs, your education, your healthcare, your older age, your transport, everything will come to you from the state. And it's a sort of benign view of what socialism could be, and a complete refusal to acknowledge the repression, the inefficiencies, the extraordinary cruelty that have accompanied these regimes over decades in many instances. And a sort of, well, it hasn't failed, we'll get it right next time. And so as the Institute for Economic Affairs in the UK has said, for example, Christian Nimitz, you get to the situation where in country after country, once the failures of socialism become apparent, commentators say, well, that wasn't real socialism. We'll get for the real thing
next time. We'll get it right next time. Yeah. Well, perhaps, folks, you're listening to Dr. Anthea Jeffery here on Chris Wyatt Reports on the Wyatt Independent News Network. Yeah, win. Welcome to the program. We're probably wrapping up here shortly. We've had a very long, I consider a fruitful discussion. I hope the audience has enjoyed it. But one of the great tragedies, and look, it's easy to be, as the American vernacular, a Monday morning quarterback. In other words, looking back, it's easy for me now to look back and go, wow, we really missed an opportunity here. But the world was formed as a consequence of the Second World War, the modern world we're living here, right? We got the Bretton Woods agreements, which create the financial system. We've got the Cold War, which divided the world after the Allied powers broke apart, which was inevitable. There's no way the Soviet Union and the United States were going to be compatible long term. But that really affected the world. The concept of the domino theory and communism taking over here and the Comintern trying to spread communism around the world and set the stage for where we're at here. But the real tragedy here is that those geopolitical philosophies and theories infected and affected the world we're living today. The example I want to give here is that Giap approached the Americans in the 1950s, and he wanted American support for freedom and independence from the French colonial masters in Indochina. And an American Army major went to meet him, unfortunately died in a traffic accident coming back from that, and nothing ever came of that conversation with Giap. I'm not saying we would have supported the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, but imagine a counterintuitive, a change in history if we had taken that approach. The irony here really, which makes that even more tragic, is that it's the United States that is responsible in large measure for the end of the colonial era. And people don't recognize that. When the Brits colluded and went into Suez in 56, it was the Americans and the Soviets. The Soviets told the Egyptians to knock it off. But it was the Americans who forced the French and the British to pull out for the threat of cutting off oil, the threat of cutting off all assistance. And they had to pull out. And the message given to them by the Eisenhower regime is that the jig is up. The colonial era is over. You need to divest yourself of your colonial holdings. We are not going to support this world. And that's what the Eisenhower administration did and pushed the Brits. And then, of course, we had Sudan. We had the Black Star Republic of Ghana become independent, yada, yada, yada. And it started a whole chain reaction of the end of colonialism. But instead of backing liberation movements in places where they didn't get help, the United States ideologically opposed that because it came down to a Cold War mentality. Look at Southern Africa, the Soviets in Mozambique and in Angola and so on. And then we're on the other side. And the tragedy is that these movements, like the ANC and other parties around Africa, Frelimo in Mozambique and the MPLA in Angola, could have potentially very well been inculcated in Western values and free market capitalism. Instead, they got their inculcation, cut their teeth in Moscow and Beijing, in East Berlin and places like that, which are anathema to the modern world. That to me, look, I mean, it's easy to say that, but honestly, imagine, an alternate parallel timeline or dimension where the world would have played out very differently. It would have been better for all of us, I think.
I think so, but I think they really did have an opportunity with the fall of the Soviet Union to rethink it all.
Yeah, to reset it. We had a chance to reset right there.
Yeah, and that was a crucial moment. And if I think about South Africa, we were on the brink of moving into our supposedly non-racial and open democracy. It could have been really those things, a non-racial and open democracy, if the ANC had not decided that they would still stick to the NDR, they would still stick to the old ways of thinking about everything, despite what was now very evidently the failure of socialism in the USSR.
Well, I agree 100%. So, Dr. Jeffery, what I typically do at the end of my conversations is I give my guests a chance to offer any final comments to talk about the topic at hand, or, sometimes we talk about rather morose subjects about how sad things are economically or politically, if they've got words of encouragement or something like that. So let me give you a chance to share anything that you like here with the audience, or if there's an issue you want to raise with me, I'll give you a chance. The floor is yours, and then we'll wrap up. How's that sound?
Gosh, that always sounds a bit scary. What do I talk about with the great range of issues that one could raise?
Well, look, I opened the
I
door. You're
think,
welcome to come back. We can do this again if you'd like.
yeah, one we haven't talked about at all is the NHI. It's one of great concern to South Africans. But of course, it's already is part of the NDR process. It began with the ANC weakening democracy, weakening all the checks and balances that the Constitution had intended to put in place. And then it moved in 2012, when Zuma happened to be president, to the economic sphere. And their rules which required racial quotas got tightened up. The threat to property rights became increased. The whole idea that you would de-link people from the capitalist system and move them to ever more dependency on the state began to accelerate. And at the same time, we had the media, unfortunately, just not playing its watchdog role. If the media had been aware, truly informed about the NDR and willing to talk about it, there could have been real warnings that came out from an early stage about what the ANC's game plan was and where it would be likely to end. And Venezuela is perhaps one of the most critical examples, because it was a very wealthy country, as you were saying, in Latin America, one of the wealthiest. And then through the wrong policies, through pursuing 21st century socialism, it has totally impoverished its people, to the great detriment of everybody, except that very small elite at the top. And Hugo Chavez, I believe, ended up as one of Forbes magazine's wealthiest people. And it's that grasping for power and for wealth among the very top elite which needs to be exposed, instead of it being assumed that this is some sort of moral quest that these parties are engaged in, and that this moral quest will somehow have good consequences for everybody but the elite. It's not the way it works in the real world. And the media and many other commentators could do much more to make that clear and to alert people to what the risks and the dangers are. So I'm very glad that you wanted to talk about the NDR, because I think it gets far too little attention.
Well, it gets a lot of attention on my part, and it's a pleasure to finally get a chance to talk to you about it, someone that certainly knows about it and has done a lot of research and been published on it. And so I want to thank you for that. But, you know, I mentioned Venezuela, but it's hardly the first example of Latin America. Go back to the 1930s in Argentina. It was one of the fifth wealthiest country on the planet. It was greatly enriched by Europeans flooding in there and colonizing it in the 1920s, 1930s, and in the aftermath of the Second World War, which, of course, included some Nazis, but we won't talk about that. But but the country was doing really well. And then, you know, this path of socialism completely destroyed it. So bad so that the generals felt compelled to try to take the Falklands. And that's another disaster in and of itself. But no, communism never works. And the next time, well, let's stop having next times. We don't want that. Yeah, we could talk next time about NHI and a host of other issues if you like. And I want to thank you so much for coming on. It's been a real pleasure. I think we could probably talk for hours and hours more, but I can give you a break here. Plus, I've got Canthan Pillay coming up in about 20 minutes, so I've got to get ready for him on our program, Iconic. So, Dr. Jeffery, thank you so much. I think the audience really enjoyed the conversation, and someone just wrote, never trust a commie. Well, I agree with that. I spent my entire adult life fighting communism, so you can see where my position is. I'm not a fan of communism.
Thank you. And thank you so much for the opportunity. It's been a great conversation. Really enjoyed it.
All right, folks, Dr. Anthea Jeffery from the Institute for Race Relations. I'll let you drop off there, and then I'll wrap up my broadcast. Have a pleasant evening, and be safe out there.
Thank you.
All right, folks, as she drops off, thanks for tuning in. I really appreciate you guys being here. I hope that you have found this to be an interesting conversation. I didn't get a chance to even look at the chat at all. My apologies for that. It's been a very engrossing conversation, as you can see, and I've wanted to talk to her for a long time. And people are always telling me about people in South Africa know who I am. Well, Dr. Jeffery didn't know who I was, so apparently I'm not that well known in South Africa. She didn't know who I was, so it was interesting to have a conversation with her. And I hope that you found it fascinating. Also, like the fact that she pushed back against some of my points, a few of which I didn't really spend a lot of time explaining in detail. But it's good to see her that she stands her ground there. Interesting conversation. So, Canthan Pillay is coming up here shortly, about 20 minutes. Thank you all for being here. I want to appreciate everyone who's joined in the chat. Thank you for your support on this program. And we keep trying to bring you folks like this. We've been very fortunate the past 2 weeks. We've had one hit after another of one great guest after one great guest, and it's just been really fascinating. So this week, we've got Canthan coming up next, and then on Thursday, we will have the gentleman responsible for that poll, which indicates that the ANC is losing support in a major way, as well as all the other major parties except for the DA. So we'll talk the methodology and about that poll from the Social Research Foundation coming up here shortly. And next week, of course, I will not be able to do a lot of interviews because I'll be doing consulting at the War College. All right, guys, y'all take care, and we'll see you shortly. You'll be automatically redirected to the CanFan broadcast Iconic if you want to see that in just a few minutes. Go well, everyone. Be safe out there. And as everyone's saying in the comments, never trust a commie. And my thanks to Dr. Anthea Jeffery. Cheers.